all tonight. I'm honored to introduce our next guest, and I feel with the way that this night has been, we have really been traveling through a very beautiful, symbolic Palestinian journey. And before I go further, I do want to send my love and my appreciation for all of the PACC staff who put this together. Thank you so much for making this happen. We are showing all of your resilience and your pride in keeping us together and keeping us steadfast and giving us a place to feel the love, because all of you love Palestine, and you should know that Palestine loves you right back. So tonight we started off with a lot of our local artists. We started off traveling slowly to Palestine, if you noticed. And with the last medley that we had, it took us to the heart of Palestine. We have a special guest tonight that her great-grandparents, they were survivors of the Nakba. They started off in Haifa, then they fled to Syria, Mukhayyam al-Yarmouk. From there, after the Syrian war broke out, our next speaker, at the age of 13, moved to Ohio. She is someone that is so talented that every time I've ever seen her perform, she's always brought people to tears. And I am personally honored because she is someone that I worked closely with as part of our first women speaking agency called Uproar. So it's a, yay, thank you, follow us on Instagram. It's for Uproar. And I'm really proud to work with her. Sara Abou Rashed is a Palestinian poet, storyteller, and public speaker. Originally from Haifa, she was born in Syria and calls Ohio home since 2013. Sara's writing appears widely, including in the anthology A Land with a People, Poetry Magazine, Poetry Wales, the Kenyan Review, the LA Review, Arab Literature Quarterly, as well as the latest high school English curriculum from McGraw-Hill. Sara has delivered a TEDx talk and keynoted many national conferences. In 2018, she created a one-woman show narrating her life across the U.S. She most recently joined Little Emmett on a few stops during the U.S. tour with a BA from Denton University and an MFA from the University of Michigan. Sara is currently working on her first book and speaking across the country. Tonight, Sara has prepared some very exquisite pieces for you all, because she knows that you're all a special audience, and this is her gift to Palestine. Without further ado, please welcome Sara Abou Rashed.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Sana. It was beautiful. We'll start with just setting everything up. Thank you all so much for having me. I have never visited Palestine, but today it feels like I did. It brought me to tears, but Allah ysamahku, with the documentary, I was crying and thinking we always underestimate how emotional it still makes us feel. 75 years ago, and still it's a fresh pain in our hearts. I feel so emotional being here, and I brought my mom all the way from Ohio. Because I knew that this community is special, and it's unlike any other, and that it's a family space, and it's a collective space, and we need to be here together. And of course, on our minds is Gaza, and by us being here together and continuing to celebrate our Palestinian identity, we keep Gaza alive. So keep that in mind. Tonight, I'm picking up exactly where some others have left off, with their poetry, their beautiful music, with the documentary. So I want to thank the entire PACC team for truly putting this phenomenal night together. Thank you guys so much. Your generosity just warms my heart. As Sanat shared, I've prepared for you kind of a night of stories and vignettes and memories and poetry. So let's get started. I want to say that as an exiled Palestinian, someone who has never been, I think a lot about what exile does to us. And I think of it as something that makes our souls porous, filled with holes. We're fractured because of exile. And that means we feel everything so much more intensely, but also that we can let more light in. And that's what we're doing here. I want to tell you about my grandmother, because this is who I inherit Palestine from. So tonight is dedicated to her. Our Palestinian identity. We keep Gaza alive. So keep that in mind. Tonight, I'm picking up exactly where some others have left off, with their poetry, their beautiful music, with the documentary. So I want to thank the entire PACC team for truly putting this phenomenal night together. Thank you guys so much. Your generosity just warms my heart. As Sanat shared, I've prepared for you kind of a night of stories and vignettes and memories and poetry. So let's get started. I want to say that as an exiled Palestinian, someone who has never been, I think a lot about what exile does to us. And I think of it as something that makes our souls porous, filled with holes. We're fractured because of exile. And that means we feel everything so much more intensely, but also that we can let more light in. Cheese, olive oil, thyme, lebene, jibne, za'atar. And I find myself knowing exactly the story she will tell next from the look on her beautiful face alone. I know my grandmother. I know her really well. The turns of her phrases, how some stories remind her of other stories, the people in her memories. It's not that she only has a few stories to share, or that I've memorized all of them, though maybe I have. But it's that I feel entrusted with the memories she carries. I feel invited to share them with her, to eat from the loaf where she cuts. My grandmother doesn't know it, but so many of my poems begin with stories that she's told me, stories about people long gone. You could say my mind has learned to see what it didn't itself witness. So I've inherited a memory of other cousins, and the list went on. It's something we do really well, the storytelling, and often the women. There are no photos of my grandmother or her family from the past anywhere. Out of nearly 1.5 million Palestinians, half of them walked in all directions, becoming refugees or internally displaced. As we know, we have different words to distinguish that in Arabic. Nazeh, lajeh. Watching the film on the news, my grandmother once said, "This little girl might be her." Know how much she weighed then, nor how tall she was when she came out of her mother's womb. We do not know the season in which she was born, nor the month, nor the day that showed her face. We do not know how much hair was on her soft head. We do not know whether she came out smiling or crying, a happy or bothered child. We do not know what she knew then, what she will spend a lifetime knowing and knowing again. What survives presumes what didn't. In refugee camps in Syria, Palestinians appeared with no documentation. They truly thought it was temporary, the abrupt move. Some, as you know, gave their gold to neighbors, their pots. They said, "Keep them until we return." I imagined them marching away as if they were a flood, emptying towns and heading to what doesn't know them. Stuffed bags, children with small hands, small steps, attempting to escape from the elders' fists. Heavy breath. On the internet, there are only a few photos of this mass exodus. Very few personal or familial, but public property of the news. What survives presumes what didn't. I wish I remembered the first time I knew who I am to the world.
I wish it was memorable for me. The exact moment I realized what it is that I am in this world, how I'll introduce myself every single time. The word that shapes my everything, my world, Palestinian. In Syria, is anyone here a Palestinian from Syria?
Lebanon.
Lebanon, yes. Also rare, yes. We have 3 people, Palestinian Lebanese. Amazing. Yeah. 4. Very rare. I know most common it's Palestinian Jordanian, but it's such an interesting identity to transport it to those camps, wherever people ended up. And in Syria, the United Nations and Relief Works Agency, also known as the UNRWA, worked with the government to give a few vacant strips of lands to those newly arrived Palestinians. It was then that they realized, oh, we're really not going anywhere. Now they're giving us a space, they'll call it a camp, they'll start to give us documentation, numbers to count us by. And that was the story of my grandparents. They were children at that point. I thought by the age of 76, my grandmother would have told me all the stories she knows, everything she has ever remembered and thought. Most of her stories I've heard 20, 30 times more. But in fact, anyone familiar with the neighborhood where I was born in Syria and grew up always makes it a point to say how ironic the name is. We've kept the name, Mukhayyam al-Yarmouk camp, even though by the time I was born, and long before that, the camp was no camp at all. It was an entire city full of buildings and beautiful restaurants and schools and fancy houses that people have built. And it was really interesting. People would go shopping there, they would move there. It was an entire homeland stitched by Palestinian refugees and their descendants. And it housed more than 200,000 Palestinians from all over the country, from different cities, different villages. So that was my experience growing up, and I didn't know the world didn't know that. Because in this part of the world, everyone carried the same wound of displacement. Everyone was Palestinian. Everyone knew the slight distinct of dialect that we spoke. We knew how our speaking is a little bit different than that of a Syrian, because we truly did not interact with Syrians much, unless it was in college or jobs or things that I personally didn't experience because I left Mukhayyam al-Yarmouk as a child. So all my friends, all my neighbors, everyone I was surrounded with was Palestinian. And of course, the argument there was that we're still called Palestinian refugees because we want to keep the right to return. That was the Syrian government's argument, that you could never become Syrian, you could never carry Syrian citizenship or passport, because that means denouncing Palestine. That means if there was a return, you would never return. You're not counted as Palestinian anymore. So we lived with a wathiqa. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that term. A mock passport, a blue passport that confuses every TSA person and says, so what exactly is this? What country, what government does it represent? Because it just means that we're descendants of refugees who lived in Syria. And for this reason, we were comfortable there. It was home, until it wasn't. But one day, my grandmother surprised me, and she mentioned a tent. And I had never once, in her stories, heard that. I think it's the kind of memory one pushes out of the story. And it angered me. It angered me so much that my grandmother mentioned it so late. Maybe something about tents still housing Palestinian refugees to this day, something about Palestinian refugees being displaced in their own country, or something about the metaphor of camps that really bothered me. I knew my camp as a city, and I kind of forgot that it was not that all the time. That at some point it truly started as tents. That these people carried everything and built something from nothing. And what we're seeing today is a continuation of that. The Nakba never once stopped. I know for us in exile, a lot of the time froze at 1948. That's where the story begins and ends. We cannot move past it. We cannot start without it. We define ourselves by the years that we left. I'm a third-generation Palestinian, and we still make Eid Ma'ruta, Ma'mul. And sometimes people say, oh, how do you still do that? Right? It was 75 years ago that your grandparents left as children. So it's possible to lose all of this. You know how they said, the old will die and the young will forget. But here we are. We did not die, and we will never forget. We never found out a way to confirm whether the little girl in the documentary is truly my grandmother. More accurately, we never bothered to confirm that. Part of us simply chose to believe it instead. Perhaps it has something to do with the way Palestinians and Arabs in general were not obsessed with documentation. So many of us don't know the years and dates of their birth. So many of our grandparents. People in other countries, they're very meticulous about that. I have a German friend who said he can trace his origin back 16 generations. And it's wild to think we're not this obsessed. Maybe what we obsess over more is the absence, is the loss. And we make up the history, and we inherit the history and stories. It only became apparent to me later in life, when I had already moved with my Palestinian family to the US, that the Syria I knew and that the Palestine I knew was not what everyone else knew. It came up in a question with a journalist who said, how does it feel like to live in the US? And where do you think you live? And I said, I live in a little Palestine, inside a little Syria, inside a big America. And today, we live in a little Palestine. Tonight, we are gathered in a little Palestine. Think how beautiful that is. I heard someone, Reem, mentioned that she feels it's like Palestine has been transported here. She doesn't feel al-ghurba as much. And it's such a beautiful thing to carry your homeland with you. So can we give a big round of applause for all of you who brought the homeland with you? Now, the story of how we got to the US is another thing. I'll mention briefly, but in my mind, slightly less interesting. Because my uncles, my mother's brothers, came here in the 80s to study in the US. And they stayed, they got citizenship, they went to college. My grandfather became a US citizen. And at some point, I don't know if this law is still active, I believe it's not, but it was that if a grandparent is a US citizen by birth or naturalization, a grandchild is automatically a US citizen too. Has anyone heard that? Some nods, some. And that's the very lucky way that I personally became a US citizen at 5 years old, all the way in Syria. Because my grandfather simply happened to be here. And in fact, he died here the year that I was born, in 1999. And when he passed away in Columbus, it was this very strange feeling for my grandmother. She left Columbus went back to Syria, and every phone call to her sons, she would say, come back, خلاص اتركوا أمريكا, شو بدكوا فيها? Come back. But then in a few years, the war in Syria started getting closer to Mukhayyam Yarmouk, and it started getting more dangerous for us, and we knew we had to leave. Everyone was thinking of a way, whether legally or illegally, or however their circumstances allowed. But alhamdulillah, our journey was much easier and smoother and kind of facilitated by strange miracles along the way that allowed us to simply hop on a plane and come here. That's how we got here to Columbus, Ohio in 2013, and believe it or not, my entire family now lives on one street. Yeah. We brought this with us. All 4 houses were within 2 minutes from each other, and it's such a beautiful thing. So that's briefly the immigration story. But I didn't know I was Syrian until I came to the US, where people would say, oh, where did you come from? And the most immediate response is, I was born and just came from Syria, but I'm not Syrian. And you know how those origin stories go. But my grandparents are Palestinian and this and that. And I'm sure we all carry those maps and those cities that have witnessed our journeys and our displacements. And I'm sure that we all carry a little Palestine everywhere we went. So that's for the stories. And I have a lot of poems for you guys. Yeah? How are we feeling? I do want to say something interesting, which is children are so powerful. When I came here 10 years ago, I was 13, and I did not speak any English. I went into high school not knowing any English, and I learned it within months. And I've always written poetry in Arabic because my grandmother would recite poetry to me, and she taught me how to do that. And she would say, oh, stand up straight, louder, etc. And so as soon as I learned English, within months of high school, of 9th grade, I knew this is something I wanted to keep doing. So the arts are resistance, and we'll talk all about why poetry specifically is really important to us. So here's a rule. If you hear something you like, you can snap. That's a poet's rule. History says. History doesn't say anyone is forgiven, it only says too late. History says we won then, but we're sorry. History says we don't ask you to accept our apologies, you have no choice. History says we wrote everything you think you know, because we thought you died. History says, and only we lived. History says, it's admirable. You've made it this far. History says, would you speak about that on our panel? History says, you shouldn't be so mad as to refuse amends. History says, trust us. We're seeing a lot of graphic imagery out of Gaza, and I felt very conflicted on that. On the one hand, we want to show the world the atrocities that are happening, and on the other, we want to honor our brothers and sisters. So here's a poem about that. Against content warnings. We stopped counting the dead, but they stayed dying. I refuse to give my horror the intimacy of a name. If a word announces what in a title, who should remember how? في العربية كلمة شهيد تشبه شهيق. نفس شهيق شهيد قتيل قاتل زفير نفس شهيد شهيق قتيل قاتل زفير نفس شهيق شهيد قتيل قاتل زفير وطني يقول الطبيب على حافة الموت ولكن حتى الآن بنفس منتظم. Gaza. It took 5 rounds of IVF to make a child, but 1 IDF missile to unmake him. Tell the world to die a Palestinian is more peace than to live as one. Even then, checkpoints may interrupt your route to heaven, to hell with all of it. This is an umbilical cord, 70 years long. I am bleeding. And my friend calls to say he's guilty. He brought a child to an open-air prison. The same day, my doctor frowns at the negative tests. Too late, I assure him. I no longer dream of children. I am pregnant with their dreams, intent to carry them to term. Gaza, part 2. Sitting deeply in deep grief and morning and night. The night's nowhere to be seen. Sight is a witness, complicit. From minarets and church pits, we elicit faith. On the eve of Christ's birth, there was death. Here, the earth as it receives the body soft and exposed tissue, the heart hard as a rock, the rock no longer figurative. We lost even the figures of our children, the outline of a body jagged, frontline, bulldozed memory. Someone somewhere is playing the violin in the background of violence. Silence is a currency we do not trade. Obscure aid, they said, but open your eyes into the mouth of a weapon. Before all this, we didn't think too often of heaven. We wanted to fly through clouds, not above them. I talked about the frozenness of memory for the exiled, and this is something that I truly feel with my grandmother, who, for her time stopped at 48, and a certain version of Palestine froze with it. So here's that. No more years of Nakba. Enough with the names and numbers and maps. My grandmother's birthplace is known only to her nose, her first gasp of life in Haifa. The bride of the Mediterranean known only to her bruised blue eyes. The Carmel mountain after which a cousin of mine is named, to her bare feet. The orchard where she ran at 3 years old, full of oranges and life, known only to her small hands, to the rough lumber which grazed them in her carpenter father's shop, known only to classroom tables and chairs he made, to children seated in schools but soon to be vacant metaphors for loss, known only to headstones, grieving mothers, and what resembles memory, what even memory would let go. More than 70 years later and thousands of miles away, when I ask my grandmother with a tape recorder in hand what she remembers, now old and empty of answers, caressing her American passport, my grandmother says, "No, I can't visit." Though she could, says, "No, I will not visit." Though I plead, says, "Why don't you understand? I love Palestine as if it no longer exists. To me, it no longer exists," and weeps a frozenness in time known only to the exiled. I have a friend, also a poet from Syria, originally Palestinian, who recently gained German citizenship and went to visit Palestine after 75 years of his family being exiled. And he said it wasn't a return visit, it was closer to suicide. أشبه بالانتحار. And when I asked him why, he said, When I saw Haifa, اشتقت لحيفا المخيم أكتر. So can you imagine yearning for the Haifa of the camp or the homeland of the camp, because this felt more authentic. This felt more like what your grandparents knew, instead of the trains and the skyscrapers and all the artificial things that are not home and that will never be home. Family tree. The first time I visited an embassy, I was 5 and went home to dream of tulips, red buds swaying in sky, the beginning of my revelations. Everything I am, I inherited. The Palestine my grandmother lost at birth. America, unexpected gift of my grandfather's tumor. My uncle searched for weeks for an opening, how to not be alone in foreign land. He extended branches to sibling, and one lucky law said, if a grandparent is a citizen, then a grandchild is one too. In Al Yarmouk camp, I knew who we were, what we carried, and told no one, except my cousin, also of my same age and circumstance. Are we spies? We joked, not knowing and correcting teachers' British pronunciations. Sarah, I would say, as if a premonition of years I would spend without glamour inside this accent. My grandmother ended every call with, when are you coming back? Like most men, my uncle reveled in being right. Just wait, he said. No immigrant travels light or with undamaged luggage. We hurried from bombs. Palestine cement lining our Damascene silk. I thank my grandmother for holding us as if her plants, with borrowed backs of wood to steady our own, and my grandfather, the only tomb we may now reach without checkpoints, whom I hadn't once seen in flesh, buried weeks before I was born. I visit him every Eid and on special occasions, even in death, a most generous man. بالنسبة لي كاضطراب فقدان الذاكرة بالنسبة لذكرياتي. أكتب كي أنسى. أما المنفى فامرأة عجوز تبكي لأنها نسيت اسمها. أكتب لأذكرها. Maybe 2 or 3 more. We'll see how everyone's feeling. You let me know. Here's a true story. Very interesting. Confession. Years after we escaped the war, we spotted our own chairs, sofas, love seats on TV while watching a Syrian series. My mother screamed over ads and the actors' voices. They were ours, those are ours. From when my grandfather won a hotel auction decades ago, giant walnut wood chairs engraved by hand. There was no mistaking the details. The mother of pearl inlays from afar, or our biggest fear, finding us wherever we are. Who knew family treasures could haunt, and not just in nightmares? My mother in America screamed over ads and actors' voices. Who needs a fake tales when reality is drama and horror enough? I can't imagine what it's like playing a character in a costume behind a voice on a chair stolen and sold God knows how many times over. We called, we asked our neighbors, they said yes, they said they saw, they said people we knew were breaking in, loading trucks worth of money and memories. Our building back in camp was now a museum and open from both ends, one by hungry hands, another by bombs slipping down airplanes like sheer stockings. I imagine it a face without features, our building. By the last episode of the series, we had found old albums, looked through flip phones, realized those chairs, they weren't exactly ours, but in our minds, they'll always be. Here's a fun poem where the rule is to come up with a line that starts with the same two letters, F and P. Free Palestine. Forget peace, flee property, flip power, fight propaganda, fix poverty, find prisoners, feed plenty, fly properly, F police, fire presidents, forget profanity, fuel people, fill pages, fight polarity, feel pride, fear poetry. Maybe one more. To leave behind. My mother keeps asking if poetry changes the world. I started to call myself a language artist after struggling a while to name my medium. Do you feel this? I made this. With you, I'm making this. My favorite professor and the girl who hated me most said the same thing. You're always writing that one poem. I don't say it, but I know I'm not that different. Like I know it's a cliche to confess it or deny. But we don't do cliches in poetry. And yet, here I am, fixed to a moment, a line, and I wish I could know more about you. Do your friends roll their eyes when you tell again that one story you love so much, even your pauses feel memorized? See, we're not that different, and I'm not trying hard to relate to you. What I am is scared of forgetting and being forgotten. My people and I are not alone in loss. Simply lonely. I'd like to be famous, so they say some of them are famous for other than dying. If context is a medium, it's mine. Words are copper casings we collect for company on the other side, the end of occupation and of life, how the bullet leaves like this, how quickly it launches, how it travels, like now, how it hits. Poetry must, my mother says. How quietly it lands. You hear me? Poetry must, and it really could. Every little thing about us, our names, our pronunciations, our spellings. To write is to resist. And I want to ask every poet, young poet who has read tonight to keep writing, and all of you to try. Because this is how we resist, with art, with culture, with our voices, with our stories. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.